Although macro photography is very accessible, no exotic locations required or expensive gear to take the best shots, it can still be a bit overwhelming for a beginner to know exactly what settings to be shooting at for the best results possible. But in this video, I will cover everything you need to know about camera settings for macro photography, along with flash settings, so if your understanding on settings is limited, then this video is for you. Before I get into the settings, I want to talk about the best camera mode to shoot with. There are two modes that are useful for macro photography, and they are aperture priority mode and manual. In aperture priority mode, you will have full control over the aperture while the camera chooses an appropriate shutter speed based on the available light. This mode is best used if you are shooting in natural light without a flash. If you are brand new to photography, I do recommend using this mode to start with and to set your ISO to auto so you don't have to think too much about your settings, and using this mode can help you get a better understanding of how the settings work. Back when I got my first DSLR camera, I would use this mode and it definitely helped me understand the settings a lot better. The next mode and the most preferred is manual mode. In manual mode, you have full control over all the settings, and in my opinion, this is the best camera mode for macro photography. Having full control allows you to make quick changes yourself instead of depending on your camera to do it for you. Most cameras now are pretty good at getting the correct exposure in auto mode or aperture priority, but it won't get the exposure right every time. In macro photography, the lighting will usually be constantly changing, and being able to make those quick adjustments yourself will make a big difference. The first setting I will talk about is the aperture, also known as f-stop. This is the most important setting in macro photography because the aperture controls the depth of field in a shot. The depth of field just refers to the amount that's in focus in a photo, and in macro photography, the depth of field is already very shallow, and it gets even more shallow the closer you get to your subject, so picking the right aperture may be confusing for a beginner. Just remember that the lower the f-stop number, the less there will be in focus, and the higher the number, the greater the depth of field will be. But I don't recommend shooting at a very high aperture, let's say f20 and above, because at this point diffraction can occur. Diffraction, in short, is an optical element which limits the total resolution of a photo. As you can see in this example, the photo on the right has a deeper depth of field because it was shot at a higher f-stop, but notice that it's not as sharp as the other image, and that is because of diffraction. The sharpest aperture for most lenses is somewhere in the middle, so I recommend experimenting with different apertures to figure out the sharpest aperture range for your lens. The sharpest range should be between f6.3 and f14, but that all depends on the lens you are using. The next most important setting to consider is your flash settings, if you use one or plan to. Having a speedlight flash is very beneficial for macro photography because most lighting situations won't be ideal for natural light photography, and having that extra light source makes a huge difference. The power of a flash will allow you to keep your ISO levels low, along with not having to shoot at a really fast shutter speed for sharp results. There are two flash modes that are beneficial for macro, and they are TTL mode and manual. In TTL mode, the flash meters the exposure by going through the lens to automatically adjust the flash power for you, so just think of it as auto mode. This mode can be very helpful if you are new to flash photography because you can use TTL without having to get too in-depth with it. If your style is more of single shots instead of focus stacks, then TTL can be the best mode for that style. In manual mode, you have full control of the lighting output of your flash. If you do a lot of focus stacking like I do, then I do recommend shooting in manual so you can shoot at one exposure for the full stack. The power of manual flash is measured in fractions, with 1:1 producing the brightest light. But keep in mind that the higher the power, the quicker it will kill your batteries, and also the higher you are shooting at, the longer the recycle time will be between shots. So I don't recommend shooting at a high power for those reasons. I personally keep my flash power strictly at 1/32, and I also shoot in manual because I prefer to have full control over the exposure. But a range between 1/64 and 1/8 is my recommended ranges for macro photography. The next setting is your shutter speed. Shutter speed is simply the speed at which the shutter of the camera closes. A fast shutter speed creates a shorter exposure, which means faster speeds will freeze the movements of the subjects you're photographing and help eliminate motion blur. A good example of when to use a fast speed is for sports photography or capturing a bird in flight. A slower shutter speed will create a longer exposure, which means that moving elements will become a blur, while stationary objects are sharp and in focus. A good example of when to use a slower speed is for star trail photography and for waterfalls. If you are not using a flash, you will need to shoot at a shutter speed no slower than 1/200th of a second at minimum, and that is because it doesn't take much at all for motion blur to show up in your photos. The slightest movement from your camera or your subject could cause it to be blurry, so shooting at a faster shutter speed will ensure you that they won't come out blurry. If you are using a flash, you won't have to worry about shutter speed as much, and that is because the duration of a flash is so much faster than any shutter speed duration, and therefore, you can still come away with sharp images even at speeds as slow as 1/20th of a second. But I usually have my shutter speeds between 1/40th and 1/250th of a second. The last setting, the ISO, is a number that represents how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. The higher the number, the higher your camera sensitivity and the less light you need to take a picture. But the trade-off is that higher ISOs can lead to degraded image quality and cause your photos to be grainy. If you are using a flash, then you don't have to worry about ISO as much because the light from a flash is pretty consistent across various lighting situations. My ISO for the majority of my shots is at 200, but sometimes I'll lower it or up it depending on the look I'm going for. But any value between 100 and 800 is more than enough if you are using a flash. If you are a natural light shooter, your ISO values along with your aperture and shutter speeds will fluctuate with the changing lighting conditions outside. If you are not ready for manual control yet, I recommend setting your ISO to auto and have your range set between 100 and 1600. And also, more often than not, you will have to shoot with a more open aperture to keep your ISO levels down. If you plan on focus stacking, set your ISO to one value so every photo is shot at the exact same exposure. I know how confusing it can be trying to understand camera settings as a beginner because I was the same way at one point. But I hope this video helped give you a better understanding on how the settings work. But just remember to keep experimenting with different settings to figure out what works best for you. Just because I have my own recommendations don't mean it's the best for you and your style. Just keep practicing, and once you get more experience with photography, Making adjustments to your settings will become much easier and quicker without much thought into what to adjust. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.